Not seeing anybody from California yet. Jackie, those Californians, they sleeping in?
I think you might be right, Anna.
Maybe they're going to catch the recording.
Yes, and we've already got a question about the recording. I'll drop a link to the chat in a few moments, but it will be going up on PAFA's YouTube channel, so you can check it out there. But I'll send you a link because we have a wonderful library of programs, many of which feature Anna and our other curatorial staff. So if you'd like to check those out, I will put that in soon.
Oh, somebody's from West Hollywood. Yeah. LA in the house.
West Coast.
West Coast. Awesome. Thanks for getting up early and joining us. Oh, yay. Stacy from Boston. And Stacy is from LA. She just happens to live in Boston. So look, we got some West Coast love. Fairfax, Virginia. Thank you. This is a big, I heard that we were going to have a lot of DC folks, DC area people in the house. Sam Docents, thank you.
Yay, Sam.
Talking about a very important painting in your collection.
Michael. Hi, Michael. Our
Oh,
New
I
York contingent is checking in.
Yeah, I see some NPG and Sam colleagues. Thank you so much for joining us. We really appreciate it. Thank you for taking the time today. Okay, everyone, we're already up to 110 and it's not even 12 noon.
And we're going to give folks a minute or two. So no, we'll get started soon, but we want to give folks, there is reported Verizon outage for the Northeast. So we might have some, if there's any delays, feel free to drop it in the chat too and let us know. But also we're going to give people a minute to get the Wi-Fi working, hopefully.
We got some New Yorkers. We got some blue hens, Delaware. So everyone, we're just so you know, because we have such a big group today, we are just asking people if they're not from the Philadelphia area, if they want to share where they're coming in from. We thank you so much for joining us today. We're going to get started really soon because there are so many of us joining today. We will not be unmuting people's microphones unless they are the speakers. But you can put your questions in the chat and then Abby will be reading questions at the end of our presentations. Abby is soon going to go over all the details with you, but I know many of you have come to our programs before and you're used to how we like to chat before we start our programs. You know, we've developed this community of friends over the past almost year of pandemic programs here at PAFA. But we love seeing you again. We're also welcoming so many new people. I think that this program has really struck a chord. And so if you've never joined us before, sometimes we only have 30 people on our programs and everybody gets to chat and say hi. But as we said, today we're expecting more than 300. And if you have friends who couldn't get on, we are recording this and we will be sharing it on our YouTube station, probably tomorrow.
Yes, thanks, Anna. And that says a great transition to get started because I know we have more folks joining us, but we have a packed program and we want to make sure we have plenty of time for all of these amazing scholars. So welcome everyone. It's so nice to see such a wonderful 167 folks already here for this special Art at Noon, Reframing the Legacy of the Capitol Building. I'm Abby King, the Assistant Director of Adult Programs here at PAFA, and I will be helping facilitate the Zoom program today. I wanted to start our program how we start so many of ours with just a huge thank you to our PAFA members for being here If you haven't considered joining and you've enjoyed our Zoom programming, I'm going to drop a link to that in the chat. But thank you to all of our members, and also just thank you to everyone for being here across the country and the world. It's so nice to be in community here with all of you. As Anna already mentioned, we have a large crowd, so we have a bit of constraints to make sure things run smoothly. So I'm a bit of the timekeeper today. We have 4 amazing panelists and our moderator, and each of them is going to be sharing a PowerPoint and going to be talking throughout the program. And then we will have time at the end for questions. So like Anna mentioned, feel free to drop things in the chat, but no, we won't be addressing that until the very end. I might be popping on to make sure things run on time, because this is an 1.5 hour program, but we do have, I think, there's always more to talk about. So you are muted, as Anna also mentioned, but we want to hear from you. This is, it's not a webinar for a reason. We love being able to see your faces, and we love to hear what you have to say in the chat. So please feel free to drop questions and thoughts as we go. I'd also recommend that you keep this in speaker mode. So on the upper right-hand corner of your Zoom screen, if you're on a computer, clicking the view button and clicking speaker mode, just so you can see our speakers large while they're speaking, and then also for the PowerPoint. This program is being recorded, and I'm going to be sharing it to PAFA's YouTube channel within the next 24 hours. So I'm going to drop a link now in the chat to that resource, as I mentioned. And I'll be dropping some more links at the very end. I also wanted to mention that we have some amazing events coming up at PAFA. So I'll link to our events calendar, and we have an event actually tomorrow at noon that at least in my mind, feels a bit like a sister program. This is called Monumental Futures. It's featuring one of PAFA's curators, Dr. Brittany Webb, and a young scholar, TK Smith, who are going to be looking at monuments and their changing role in symbolizing or addressing systematic inequality, injustice, and erasure. So we hope you can join us tomorrow at noon, and I'll drop that in the chat as well. So today, in the spirit of what it means to reframe the history and legacy of this country, I'd like to take a moment before introductions to acknowledge that the land on which I'm gathering, I know we're from all around the world and the country, but where I'm speaking to you from are the ancestral lands of the Lenni Lenape people, whose presence and resilience in Pennsylvania continues to this day. We also want to take a moment and mention that the images and stories that are going to be shared are inherently challenging for some, and so viewing them might be re-traumatizing. I'm inviting you to participate today in whatever way feels comfortable to you, including if you just want to listen but minimize the videos. It's now my esteemed privilege to introduce our presenters for this program. I'm going to run through all 5 of our fantastic panelists. And when I'm done with each of them, I am going to ask them to unmute themselves and say hello, just so we know in the crowd of 200 people who we're speaking to today, in case anybody's new. So Dr. Jacqueline Francis is the chair of the Graduate Visual and Critical Studies program at California College of Arts in San Francisco. She is the author of Making Race, Modernism and Racial Art in America, and the co-editor of Romare Bearden, American Modernist. Francis is a co-executive editor of Panorama, Art and Visual Culture of the United States. She serves on the advisory board of Third Text, Critical Perspectives on Contemporary Art and Culture, and she is an at-large member of the National Committee for the History of Art. She is the board president of the Queer Cultural Center, a multidisciplinary resource and advocacy site for LGBTQ artistic expression in San Francisco. Jackie, will you mind saying hello to everybody?
Hello, everybody. Welcome. Looking forward to being here with you.
Thank you so much for being here. Next, we have Dr. Vivien Green-Fried, Professor Emerita in the Department of History of Art and Architecture at Vanderbilt University. She is the author of Art and Empire, The Politics of Ethnicity in the U.S. Capitol, 1815 to 1860. Art and the Crisis of Marriage, Georgia O'Keeffe and Edward Hopper, and Against Our Will, Sexual Trauma in American Art since 1970.
Hello, everybody. Thank you, friends and colleagues, for being present.
Thank you. Next up, Dr. Christian Ayne Crouch is the Associate Professor of History and the Director of American Studies at Bard College. Her award-winning book, Nobility Lost, offered a cultural history of war, in the 18th century French Atlantic. And her current book project, Queen Victoria's Captives, A Story of Ambition, Empire, and a Stolian Ethiopian Prince, looks at the human and material culture consequences of the world's most expensive hostage rescue mission. Her research also includes Native American and Indigenous studies and art, and she recently served as a curatorial advisor for the Brooklyn Museum's 2020 show, Jeffrey Gibson, When Fire is Applied to Stone It Cracks, and co-curator for the public programs for CCS Hessel Museum Sky Hopinka Centers of Somewhere. Dr. Christiane Crouch, will you say hello?
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for being here, especially to former students who are out there.
Oh, that's wonderful. Thank you, Christiane. And our last panelist, but not my last introduction, is Dr. Amy Werbel, Professor of History of Art at the State University of New York, the Fashion Institute of Technology. Her scholarship for the past decade has focused on art censorship, including most recently her book, Lust on Trial, Censorship and the Rise of American Obscenity in the Age of Anthony Comstock, published by Columbia University Press in 2018. She has also served as a Fulbright Scholar both in China and in the United Kingdom. Welcome, Dr. Werbel. Oh, I'm going to ask to unmute.
There we go. Hello. So honored to be here. Thank you for inviting me, and greetings from the homeland of the Montaukett people.
Thank you, Amy. And last but certainly not least, we have our moderator and my wonderful colleague, Dr. Anna O'Marley, the Kenneth R. Woodcock Curator of Historical American Art and the Director for the Center of the Study of the American Artist. Working at PAFA since 2009, she has curated over 16 exhibitions and edited numerous publications, including Henry Ossawa Tanner, Modern Spirit, The Artist's Garden, American Impressionism and the Garden Movement, From the Schuylkill to the Hudson, Landscapes of the Early American Republic, and the forthcoming Women in Motion, 150 Years of Women's Artistic Networks at the Pennsylvania Academy of the Fine Arts. She is the former chair of the Association of Historians of American Art and currently serves on the advisory board of the Smithsonian Archives of the American Art Journal. And I'm going to hand it over to you, but thank you all to our amazing panelists for being here and for our audience too.
All right, thank you, Abby. I'm just going to make sure that I can share my screen and get us started. All right, thank you all so much for joining us today. Thank you, Abby, for organizing this. And our head of public education, Monica Zimmerman, for asking Abby and I to work on this project. Thank you to everybody at PAFA for supporting all we do in our programs. And we're thrilled that so many PAFA people have joined us today, including our director, Brooke Davis Anderson, and our colleagues from all over the country and the world. Thank you. We're thrilled that so many of you are here today to discuss this timely topic. So how it's going to work is I am going to get started with some remarks, and then we'll turn it over to our speakers. As questions enter your mind, please feel free to put them in the chat. As Abby mentioned, there are so many of us today. We will not be asking people to ask their questions directly, but if you put it in the chat, Abby will ask your questions to us when we get done with our short presentations. All right, on January 6, 2021, this was the photograph that struck with me viscerally. This appears to be a simple, perhaps even calm image, but it is not. It is terrifying in its symbolism of an attack on the very heart of the US Republic. These US Capitol officers gathering riot gear are carefully walking around stanchions in the US Capitol crypt, the room directly underneath and architecturally supporting the Capitol rotunda and dome. In the center of the stanchions is a small golden star which denotes the point from which the streets in Washington are laid out and numbered. This star represents the center of the Capitol building, the center of Washington, D.C., the very center and compass stone or navel of the American Republic itself. This is the exact location that George Washington was meant to be buried before the Washington family decided to keep him in a purpose-built mausoleum at Mount Vernon. As a former fellow of the U.S. Capitol Historical Society, working with the Office of the Curator of the Architect of the Capitol in the summer of 2017, I walked through this space many times. And I was privileged as a fellow to have worked under the mentorship of Michelle Cohen, who is the current curator of the architecture of the Capitol. So I walked through this space many times, and I was always in awe of its symbolism, which recalled to me the tomb of the Holy Sepulchre in Jerusalem. Every day, I passed through a security gauntlet of Capitol Police who ran my bags through a metal detector, despite the fact that I was a registered and background checked fellow for the summer. Every day, I was aware of the symbolism and power of this building, which my colleague, Dr. Fernanda Pita of Sao Paulo, Brazil, has aptly described as, quote, impressive and oppressive, when we visited the building together earlier in that summer of 2017. Like many around the world, watching the images on social media on January 6th, I was struck with a sense of violation of this space, sacred to American democracy and American identity. But unlike many who watched the events unfold in the Capitol that day, I was not surprised. The events of January 6, 2021 were merely the logical outcome of 4 years of white supremacist pre-fascism, and indeed an outcome of many of the darkest imageries embedded in the architecture and art of the Capitol itself. As Timothy Snyder Levin, professor of history at Yale, wrote in The American Abyss, which was the New York Times Magazine cover story on January 17th of this year, quote, "The racism structured into every aspect of the coup attempt is a call to heed our own history. Serious attention to the past helps us to see risks, but also suggests future possibility. We cannot be a democratic republic if we tell lies about race, big or small," end quote. In our program today, we have assembled a group of scholars of American art, history, material and visual culture to heed that history. Many of my colleagues in the field have already begun this work, including many of you on this call today. And I anticipate that this conversation will continue to evolve and grow actionable way beyond this conversation. As a country and as a field of study, we need to be honest about how we have gotten to January 6, 2021, if we are to ever heal from it. On the evening of January 6th, I was heartened to see lawmakers head back to Congress and the Senate to certify the votes and validate the Democratic presidential election. I was watching live when Nancy Pelosi reconvened Congress and chastised the mob for, quote, "the gleeful desecration of this, our temple of democracy," end quote. Yet I was struck by the somewhat willfully optimistic ignorance of those remarks, that this building is not only a temple to democracy. And I'm showing you here images, three images from the rotunda of the US Capitol. It is a temple to racism, a temple to patriarchy, a temple to genocide, and a temple to empire. And so what you see here is, in order of the time they were created, a relief carving of the pioneer Daniel Boone fighting with the Shawnees from the 1820s, a painting of the baptism of Pocahontas from the 1840s, which is one of the large rotunda paintings that you've seen in so many images, and a frieze showing the invasion of Mexico City by the United States during the Mexican-American War that is part of the frieze of the US history up in the top of the Capitol. That senators, members of Congress, and others can walk through the rotunda every day and not acknowledge this truth seems to me one of the greatest challenges of living up to the better angels' aspirations and values of this democratic republic. I was heartened that this was called out and not denied in the inauguration ceremony on January 20th, not only by President Biden, but especially in the benediction delivered by African Methodist Episcopal Reverend Sylvester Beeman, who called out the truth, quote, that from these hallowed grounds where slaves labored to build this shrine to liberty and democracy, end quote, on land stolen from indigenous Native Americans, that this is our country. Beyond the benediction, another potentially heartening and healing moment on January 20th was Jill Biden's, a blue hen, go Blue Hens, choice of a painting from the Smithsonian American Art Museum's collection to be a centerpiece of the giving of gifts in the Capitol Rotunda on Inauguration Day by 19th century African-American landscape painter Robert S. Duncanson. This painting is literally temporarily transposed over one of the mammoth rotunda paintings by Trumbull, celebrating the recreation of the United States and the hagiography of George Washington resigning his commission. First president and owner of generations of enslaved Americans. William Penn looks on, negotiating peacefully with the Lenape Indians, whose stolen land I speak to you from today. Lurking to the far right of this photograph, which may be covered by our Zoom heads, so you might want to close us up, is a bronze statue of Andrew Jackson, hero to the Capitol insurrectionist mob and perpetrator of the barbaric Trail of Tears. Duncanson himself, though a successful landscape painter, had to flee to Canada during the American Civil War for his bodily safety. As scholars of American art and as democratic citizens, these truths must be acknowledged and heeded for us to move forward to form a more perfect union. With this introduction, I turn the lectern over to my esteemed colleague, Jackie Francis.
Thank you, Anna. I'll start off by thanking PAFA and the team there for inviting me to this online discussion. I'm happy to participate, not only because I have not stopped thinking about what happened at the Capitol on January 6th, but also because of the opportunity to engage with my colleagues on today's panel. Our preparation started last week with a lively hour-long Zoom call. My remarks today have been enriched by that preparatory session of January 19. In the last 50 years, art historians and visual cultural studies scholars have written a lot about the participation of sitters in the making of portraiture. It's a convincing argument. Artists do not make pictures alone. Subjects and sitters can be the artist's partners in collaborative projects, even if the partnership is not equal. Can I have the next slide, please, Anna? Many have seen this photo taken for Getty Images by Wynne McNamee on January 6th. Here, a man acknowledges the photographer as he balances a podium on his shoulder. Happy and proud that he has removed the object from the House chambers, he is a self-aware subject. Of course, on January 6th, we did not know who he was, although we could see what he was: a thief, a looter, an engaging white-appearing man, appropriately bundled up for a winter day in DC, in a hooded load-in jacket and knitted ski cap, bearing the name of the then president and the decal associated with his position in the line of executive branch holders. His coat is unzipped, so that we can see a scarf that seems to bear a bit of Old Glory's pattern, white stars against the blue field. He wears Asics running shoes. Since January 6th, we've learned more about this fellow. He is Adam Christian Johnson, age 36, of Parrish, Florida, a subdivision which is just outside of Bradenton, Florida. Within a day of the riots at the Capitol, Parrish and Bradenton residents who recognized him in the photos, the Getty photos, called authorities who were searching for information about the mob actors. Johnson was arrested on January 9, and he was charged with 3 felonies: entering and remaining in a restricted building without lawful authority, theft of government property, violent entry, and disorderly conduct on Capitol grounds. He was released on January 11, having signed a bond for $25,000. The Tampa Bay Times in Florida dubbed Johnson, quote, one of the most prominent symbols of the riot, end quote. In the rotunda on January 6, Johnson and the others who were fired up for insurrection were surrounded by symbols of idealized masculinity. Behind Johnson's raised hand is the National League of Families Prison of War Missing in Action flag, created by commercial artist Newton Heisley in 1972. The flag's black silhouette, based on the profile of Heisley's Marine Corps son, Jeffrey, is accompanied by the words, "You are not forgotten," and summary images of imprisonment, a guard tower, and a barbed wire fence. In the 1980s, the US Congress recognized the MIA POW flag as, quote, a symbol of our nation's concern and commitment to resolving as fully as possible the fates of Americans still prisoner, missing, and unaccounted for in Southeast Asia, thus ending the uncertainty for their families and the nation, end quote. Military service and sacrifice and leadership are signified by Franklin Simmons's marble statue of Ulysses S. Grant of 1899. The figure is represented with 4 stars on his epaulets and designated as the General of the Army of the United States. Across the walkway, on the right, is Vinnie Ream's marble of Abraham Lincoln, Grant's Civil War Commander-in-Chief. In 1866, Ream became the first woman to win an artistic commission from the United States government. Her work was completed in 1871. The red marble base that it stands upon was added in 1877. In the photograph, a bald, white-appearing man seems to be looking toward John Trumbull's painting, Surrender of General Burgoyne of 1821. The canvas is huge. It memorializes the defeat of British forces at the Battle of Saratoga in New York in the fall of 1877. Trumbull chose to depict the red coat wearing Burgoyne conceding. He offers his sword to his counterpart, Horatio Gates. Gates moves not to accept the weapon, and the open sweep of his arms has been interpreted as a fraternal action, that Burgoyne is inviting Gates to join him in the tent bearing the Colonial Army flag at the rear. In other words, the painting of these men in dress uniforms is a moment of comradeship and recognition about hard-fought battles won and lost on behalf of nations or would-be nations. Seeing Adam Christian Johnson cradling the Speaker of the House lectern made me think of War and Casualties. The lectern was recovered in the Capitol building on January 6th and is said to have been physically undamaged. Still, I know that January 6th was a day of damage. 5 people died as a result of the onslaught. Psychic damage is still to be assessed and addressed, even for those who were not there, people like me, because I know that the people storming the Capitol, even the ones who were there and who may even identify the way I do, female, Black, queer, progressive, they nonetheless do not wish me well. Furthermore, I would add that the lectern was a surrogate for the body of Speaker of the House, Nancy Pelosi. I live and work in San Francisco, the traditional and unceded Chochenyo and Ramaytush lands. Pelosi represents my congressional district. As we know, among the recorded chants and shouts on January 6 was, "Where's Nancy?" Even now, as I speak these words, I'm having trouble doing so. They take my breath away, imagining what several thousand rioters would have done had they found Nancy Pelosi or any other women who were their well-publicized targets of ire. Next slide, please. Would the mob have taken up these elected officials and maybe other Capitol workers in their arms, slung them across their shoulders, kidnapped them, or violated them? It's impossible not to think of the subject of the abduction and rape of the Sabine women when we think about January 6th. In the historian Livy's telling, the ancient Romans sought to maintain their city-state strength and to increase their numbers. Women of childbearing age were the instruments for doing so. The men of Rome abducted 30 women from neighboring regions during the 8th century BCE, a story that the Italian Baroque painter Sebastiano Ricci summarizes in this painting. In this portrait of a state and its citizens, the dynamic tumult in the painting's foreground plays against the relative calm and stability of the architectural backdrop. Perhaps the implied sway of the tall trees mimics the writhing bodies as women struggle to escape men's grasp. Ricci has made the women formidable figures to emphasize that they are likely to produce healthy children, and many of them. Ricci instills character and personality via the varied rendering of gestures and expressions. In the foreground, the men stolidly go about their task, although we never see any of their faces in full. Their captives' frowns, extended arms, and splayed fingers are meant to signify anger, despair, and resistance. The painting's middle ground is also full of action. On the left, a woman stiff arms her attacker, and that's in the midground. She stiff arms her attacker, who has her almost to the ground. More toward the center of the painting, also in the midground, there's a woman down on the steps, and the right leg of a Roman man is nearby. The takeaway of this picture is that this is how nations are made, with force, a fact that is not always communicated in classical architecture's balanced pediments, stout columns, and volute ornamentation. Still, as a whole, paintings such as Ricci's tell us a lot about the ownership of bodies, culture, buildings, and land as property, and about our acceptance of ideological constructs. This is clear in the Wynne McNamee photo of Adam Christian Johnson, and in this painting as well. Next slide, please, Anna. In the bright light of day, a ginger-haired white man moves to lift a scarecrow's boater from its head. Because the man touches his own battered hat as he's liberating the scarecrows, the inference is that there'll be a switch. Although the term fair exchange, no robbery suggests even Steven, Mount's purview may or may not have been such. Art historians Elizabeth Johns, Charles Colbert, and Martin A. Berger are among the scholars who've written about Mount's genre paintings. Johns has interpreted them as subtle critiques of Mount's 19th century milieu. Colbert has advanced Johns' views, stating that this painting can, quote, be considered a simple anecdote about those who adopt expedient standards of conduct, end quote. Yet Berger finds ambiguity here in fair exchange, no robbery. Berger rightly notes that Mount places the man, scarecrow, and dog outside the less tended cornfield, suggesting that this down on his luck, not laboring man is not trespassing. Instead, he's walking through open land that some viewers would link to, quote, fair appropriation, end quote. Similarly, Berger suggests that viewers would have read theft from a scarecrow as no theft at all. And as an aside, we can note that even the dog is perturbed in this scene, unperturbed in this scene. Berger concludes that no matter what the subject of Mount's painting is, that, quote, European Americans viewed it through the lens of white privilege. The logic of whiteness rationalizes appropriating what belonged to those unprotected by the designation as white, end quote. While Berger asserts that fair exchange, no robbery says nothing about race, I beg to differ. Whiteness is race, and Mount's painting speaks to its development in America. The Getty photo of Adam Christian Johnson is testimony to the maintenance of whiteness and the contestation of it in our times. We have to ask ourselves how the white workers at the Capitol on January 6th, elected officials, and other employees that make the place run, were not fully protected by whiteness. Furthermore, we have to sit with the phenomenon of people storming the Capitol, ginning themselves up by proclaiming to each other in solidarity, this is our house. Their house to break in and enter into like burglars, to scoop up stuff like war booty, to menace and hunt for politicians, to console themselves by occupying representatives' chambers and offices, putting boots on desktops, and rifling through government documents. Their house in which to fight with and attack police who were there to protect the assets of racialized capitalism and to uphold a classed white supremacist order. Last but not least, this is our house was a warning, articulated to underscore that everything has been theirs, for the taking, and always should be. That phrase was summoned to test everyone who witnessed their acts, for it begs the questions, what do we stand for, and what are we willing to do? Thank you.
Thank you, Jackie. All right, our next speaker is Dr. Vivien Fried-Green. And Vivien, just let me know when you want me to advance the slides.
Okay, great. Thank you. I also want to express my thanks for being included in this discussion. When I was doing research on the US Capitol building in the 1980s, I would never have imagined what happened on January 6th. Back then, you could walk into the US Capitol building with anything. Nobody checked you before you walked in. And I had access and freedom to see everything in the US Capitol building. And Barbara Wolanin, who was the curator at the time, was very kind to show me a lot of things that I didn't have access to. So when January 6th happened, I became, like everybody, not only upset, but obsessed. I hadn't worked on the US Capitol building in a very long time. And I spent 2 days just writing about what I was seeing in relationship to the works of art in the US Capitol building. And then when I was invited to participate in this, I spent another 2 full days just writing excessively. I just want to say that I think this is really important for us to be discussing. And I am really grateful that the Pennsylvania Academy of Fine Arts and everybody associated with putting this together had this in mind to have us do this discussion. Can I have the first slide, Anna? During the January 6, 2021 riot, in which the pro-President Trump mob stormed the United States Capitol building, someone set up a noose hanging from gallows outside the west side of the US Capitol building. This is evident in this photograph taken by Andrew Cabarella Reynolds and available via Getty Images on many internet sites and on the television news. I am interested in how the gallows, can I have the next slide? As a picture frame with its hanging orange noose, directs attention to the statue on the top of the dome. Thomas Crawford Statue of Freedom, which you can see on the left. This ostensible monument to freedom is equally a monument to the struggles for freedom by African Americans, especially a struggle that continues to this day, which is poignant in the inconsistency between the way authorities responded to the Black Lives Matter protesters and the way in which they responded to the white insurrectionists in the United States Capitol building. The 2021 image of the noose conflates the Southern historical signifier of lynchings with their terrorist threat to punish senators, representatives, and Vice President Pence for committing what the rioters considered treason in certifying the election results for President Joseph Biden. As a Proud Boys leader had written on Parler in early January, and I quote, "Every lawmaker who breaks with their own stupid fucking laws should be dragged out of office and hung," close quote. As the pro-Trump protesters invaded the US Capitol building, some chanted, "Hang Mike Pence," and traitors to the guillotine. The white man seen in some videos as hanging the noose on the gallows clearly intended to allude to the history of lynchings of mostly Black men that took place in the South between 1882 and 1968. Like the 21st century rioters, 19th and early 20th century men who committed lynchings intended to maintain white supremacy in the economic, social, and political spheres. In fact, the recent crowd of protesters outside and inside the United States Capitol building resembles the large number of white people who would gather in order to witness the earlier lynchings. Crawford statue has its history in the Civil War and highlights the ideological role that race and racism played in the United States public culture from the Compromise of 1850 to the close of the Civil War in 1865. Between 1863 and 1857, Jefferson Davis, the Secretary of War and future President of the Confederacy, oversaw the construction and decoration of the Capitol extension. And that was what is now the Senate and House side of the US Capitol building, as well as the dome on top of the Capitol building. Jefferson Davis, a slave owner, congressman, and senator from Mississippi, vehemently argued for the slave system and the extension of slavery into newly acquired lands. In fact, the Statue of Freedom, begun in 1855 after the highly controversial passage of the Fugitive Slave Act and the publication of Harriet Beecher Stowe's Uncle Tom's Cabin, and finished in 1863 during the Civil War, has much to teach us about the intricacies of race and racism as it can about the politics of public art and slavery. Crawford originally intended to show the statue wearing a Liberty cap, which you can see on his design on the right, to allude to the slaves' struggle for freedom. And you can see the cap on the top of her head. However, Davis argued in a letter to Montgomery C. Meigs, the supervising engineer of the Capitol extension, that the cap's, quote, history renders it inappropriate to a people who were born free and who would not be enslaved, close quote. He rejected allusions to freedom from slavery, recognizing the traditional personification of liberty usually wore a cap and held a pole. Can I have the next slide, please? And you can see that on the right, Paul Revere's engraving of liberty that was published in a Massachusetts newspaper in 1783. Davis clearly understood the practice of ancient Roman manumission, in which freed slaves covered their newly shorn heads with the liberty cap, while magistrates touched them with a rod. It is the association between liberty and manumission in ancient Rome that provoked Davis's opposition to the cap during the 1850s. The Secretary of War made this argument to reject the notion that the slaves on his plantation also desired the type of freedom. He refused to allow any work in the US Capitol building that alluded to slavery, either overtly or covertly via the cap, to be included. And although Crawford may have intended the cap to refer to independence or the concept of liberty embodied in American democracy, Davis's objections ironically ensured its symbolic association with modern slavery, whether or not the artist originally intended this meaning. Davis wanted instead what he called an armed liberty, to wear a helmet, given, quote, that her conflict is over, her cause triumphant, close quote. In response to Davis's objections and recommendations, Crawford replaced the cap with a helmet, thereby evoking Phidias's fable Athena Parthenos, which you see on the left. The goddess of war and of the city, protector of civilized life, an embodiment of wisdom and reason. Crawford based his statue on Quatremere de Cancy's 1825 reconstruction of what Phidias's destroyed monument had looked like. By adding the feathers to the helmet, Crawford associated America with liberty, which you again see on the right in Paul Revere's engraving. An iconographic tradition that began before the Revolutionary War, where the Indian princess with tobacco leaf skirt and headdress holds a cap and pole. As a result, Crawford's Statue of Freedom is a hybrid and confusing monument that combines three traditional personifications: liberty, signified by the title, Athena, signified by the helmet, and America, signified by the eagle feathers. Crawford's Statue of Freedom reminds us that as words and iconographic symbols, freedom and liberty had a lineage stretching back to the ancient world, a lineage that those of today are keen to claim for themselves. Crawford's Statue of Freedom combines a multitude of others who compose the United States democracy. The Black body as embodied in the cap, which Davis omitted, the indigenous body in the form of the eagle feathers, an allegory to America as an Indian princess, and the female body in the form of the female allegory, as well as the primitive body, which intersects the first two. These coalesce in Crawford's statue and in Davis's own vision of white male superiority that he insisted be represented in the US Capitol Dome statue, as well as other works of art in the US Capitol building. Both Davis in the 19th century and the mostly white mob in the early 21st century make clear that white privilege and racism unfortunately still exist in this country. For all the language of revolution, all the words that the rioters spouted on January 6th, the more complex story of the United States rests in his paintings and sculpture of the building they were storming, in the physical fabric of the United States Capitol itself. Among those messages that subscribe must belong to us all, that the fight therefore is inclusive, not just those of one group, that the fight is against, not in support of leaders who would assume king-like powers. As Barack Obama claimed when he was inaugurated as the 44th president of the United States in 2009, underneath the dome of the US Capitol building and underneath the Statue of Freedom, and I quote President Obama, "The time has come to reaffirm our enduring spirit, to choose our better history, to carry forward that precious gift, that noble idea passed on from generation to generation, the God-given promise that all are equal, all are free, All deserve a chance to pursue their full measure of happiness. Close quote. Can I have the next slide, please? The noose with gallows that formed the United States Capitol Dome, the United States Capitol Dome and Crawford Statue of Freedom, attempted to erase Obama's words and sentiments, wanting President Trump to hold a second term that would have allowed racist sentiments to prevail among the alt-right and dominate the news cycle. Fortunately, this did not happen. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Vivien. I'm going to pass the lectern over to Dr. Christiane Ayne Crouch, my good friend. Welcome, Christiane.
Thank you so much, Anna. I want to join all of my colleagues on today's discussion for thanking PAFA and everyone who organized this event, to thank everyone in the audience for being here. As Dr. Francis said, I also learned a great deal from our pre-session on January 19th. And I'm very pleased to be able to join you from the homelands of the Munsee and Mahikanic people, now known as the Stockbridge-Munsee community. They were forcibly removed from their homelands and now reside in northeastern Wisconsin. And it is in the spirit of equity and justice as they wish that I join this talk. First slide, please, Anna. This is America. Although I was shocked by the images of January 6th emerging from the attempted coup at the US Capitol, as a historian of settler colonialism and of race and slavery from the colonial period to the present, I have to admit I was not much surprised. A week later, this image began circulating widely. And I was struck by the sentiment when I saw this of, this is America, and yet this isn't America. And what I meant with that was, this isn't the America that I am used to seeing. I am not used to seeing military encampments at the heart of a civilian visitor center. I am not used to seeing the outpouring of troops in my adopted hometown of Washington, D.C., where you have 15,000 National Guards and now 7,000 remaining. And yet, on the other hand, I was also struck by the reality that this is America. And I say this for a few reasons. First, as this image shows, there is the juxtaposition of the seemingly pacific, benign, beatific sculpture of the spirit of freedom that Dr. Freed just mentioned, looking down on the National Guard's troops below. This is the image, in some sense, that we have been taught to expect. The Republic, blessing the troops who defend our democracy. And indeed, for most Americans, freedom, as we imagine it, is coded to flow north domestically, the Underground Railroad moving us north, to flow north now to the global north. And this really came clearly with the statements that emerged from January 6th, phrases that were uttered by former presidents, such as former President George W. Bush, as well as circulating endlessly on social media. Quote, "We are not a banana republic. This isn't America. This happens elsewhere. This is not who we are." And those vehement denials, rooted in US exceptionalism and the myth that the United States has never been an empire, returned for me into my heart with this image. Because, as I'd like to argue today, to much of the rest of the world, what this image shows is America. A superabundance of troops ready to enforce the values of the United States, primarily economic and also somewhat political, standing under the term of freedom. The inescapable whiteness of this version of Thomas Crawford's statue leaps out of this photo frame. We are, as Standing Rock Sioux descended scholar Phil Deloria pointed out, playing Indian here, coding our allegory of freedom as an imagined Native woman, not really a Native woman, but a stand-in, a handy, useful cipher. The carving here renders her white, and this photo reminds me of the patriarchal protection afforded to and the violence undertaken in the name of defending white women that has long characterized both colonial ventures in the Atlantic and in particular the United States, always defending them under the imagined threats of brown and Black individuals. And yet those same protections are not afforded to brown and Black women. Representative Ayanna Pressley's panic buttons had been ripped out of her office on January 6th, a reminder that Black and Native women do not benefit from the protections afforded their white sisters. And similarly too, many of those women who benefit from such protections are not interested in extending those. The "I don't really care, do you" that could be imagined on the back of this cipher spirit of freedom. We can move to the next slide, please. Now, among the many photographs that emerged on January 13th of the National Guard, not just sleeping in the US Capitol Visitor Center, but also traversing the United States Capitol, this particular photograph stood out, in particular for continuing a theme that I saw previously, and that you've heard a little bit about already, the ways in which the Capitol is not a neutral space. I thought this particular photograph did a wonderful job of capturing the reality that in the United States, we ignore Native history at our peril. The National Guardsman capturing the moment on his smartphone is turned away from the 2019 sculpture given by the state of Nebraska of the Ponca chief Mashinage, or Standing Bear, just as most Americans relegate Native peoples and Native concerns to the past and not into our present. In 1879, Mashinage won a civil rights case. The case was Standing Bear v. Crook, and it was in a US district court. And that ruling established that Native individuals were, quote, persons within the meaning of the law. Mashinage and his lawyer had successfully argued that Native peoples were entitled to civil rights under American law. Now, Nebraska gifted the statue in 2019, replacing a prior statue of William Jennings Bryan. 2019, 2 years after the Keystone Access Pipeline moved forward, abrogating the terms that the United States had agreed upon in the 1868 Treaty of Fort Laramie with United Lakota and Dakota Nations. 2019, the same year that the state of South Dakota moved to further restrict Native individuals from exercising their constitutional right to vote, a right enshrined since the 1924 Indian Citizenship Act. This photograph of Mashinage in Statuary Hall shows him in proximity to a statue from Ohio of Thomas Edison, holding his most famous invention, the light bulb. Edison was also a proponent of racial stereotypes and phrenology. And on the right, we see Tennessee's contribution of John Sevier, a state founder and an enslaver, who built a military reputation by fighting and killing Indians. At President Joe Biden's inauguration last week, Jennifer Lopez sang, "This land is your land," but did not add that the Capitol sits on Piscataway land. Imagine for many Native individuals what the iconography inside the United States Capitol and the United States Capitol building itself represents every day, not just on January 6th, 2021. If I can have the final slide, please. John Vanderlyn's landing of Columbus, the photo in the upper left here, like the rotunda friezes and numerous other images hanging on the walls or literally carved into the stone of the building, celebrates the settler colonialism upon which this nation is founded. We might not call ourselves an empire. What we euphemistically term westward expansion is imperial expansion. The addition of Native individuals in the pantheon of US history has been slow, and what I did here was I selected from among the few statues of Native men and women in the Capitol's collection. I focused on these individuals. The Cherokee leader Sequoyah, who created the Cherokee syllabary, King Kamehameha I of Hawaii, Sarah Winnemucca, Paiute activist and author, and Pope. I chose these individuals because each of them advocated for Native sovereignty and human rights in the face of genocidal violence and land theft from Euro-Americans. And I want to add that some of these statues have not been added without controversy. There was an outcry when New Mexico decided to offer the statue of Pope for those arguing that his actions in rebellion against Spanish settler colonialism in the Pueblo Uprising of 1680 constituted a form of terrorism. As we think about what the United States Capitol means, we have to reckon with this question of who is included and how. We have to remember that we still sideline millions of citizens, excluding them from seeing themselves in the people's house, or forgetting their role in the creation, the shaping, and the continuation of this people's house. The January 6th rioters behaved as they did because they are part of the building, and they felt that they could take the building with them. This too is America. Thank you.
Thank you, Christiane. All right, our last speaker today is Ayne, and she is going to wrap us up, and then we are going to have time for questions. Ayne.
Hi, thank you so much. I want to echo my colleagues in thanking Abby and Anna and PAFA for organizing this important talk. I've learned a lot and there's so much more to learn. May I have the first slide, please? On January 6th, 2021, Kevin Seafried and his son Hunter traveled to Washington, D.C. to pressure Congress to overturn the results of the 2020 presidential election. That afternoon, after helping to break a window, they entered the US Capitol building, carrying with them the family's Confederate battle flag. Hunter was so proud of their father-son outing that he bragged about their participation to a coworker who promptly reported them to the FBI. The Seafrieds are not significant figures in this dramatic day, except for the fact that their crimes were captured by the courageous photojournalist Mike Teeler, working for Reuters, in images which have since circled the globe as potent signifiers of the visual and spiritual trauma of the events of January 6th. Among the many tragedies of that day, Black legislators and congressional aides told the New York Times that their feelings of safety at work had crumbled. An aide to Senator Elizabeth Warren, Josh Delaney, who is Black and grew up in Georgia, reported that the Confederate flag was a, quote, painful but commonplace reminder of where he was not welcome. I have always felt like the Capitol is the safest place I could be. To have that illusion shattered, I don't know that I'll ever have that same feeling again, end quote. This infliction of psychic harm by the Seafrieds was not new. In interviews with local news outlets, they shared that the Confederate flag usually flew outside their home in Laurel, Delaware. Census records show that 40% of the population of Laurel, Delaware identified as African American in 2010. So many of the Seafrieds' neighbors likely have suffered a similar feeling of danger on a regular basis as the result of their actions. Ideally, given what the Confederate battle flag symbolizes, every American should be traumatized by the sight of this flag in the US Capitol. The particular version carried by Seafried is the iteration of the Confederate flag which accompanied the most violent acts of insurrectionists on behalf of preserving white Americans' so-called states' rights to hold African Americans in the legal status of chattel or personal property. We see a portrait of one of the loudest supporters of slavery, South Carolina Senator John C. Calhoun, at left in the photo, and also a bust of Richard Nixon on the right. The battle flag that partially obscures Calhoun largely disappeared from view in the years following the Civil War. White supremacist protesters began to fly it again during the Civil Rights era to symbolize their opposition to the federal government's efforts to end Jim Crow laws and extend equal civil liberties and educational opportunities to African Americans. In a remarkable twist of fate, Teeler photographed Kevin Seafried just as he was about to pass beneath the third portrait in the scene at center. Painted by Walter Ingalls, this side profile view depicts Massachusetts Senator Charles Sumner, a radical Republican who joined with his close friend Frederick Douglass to lead the call for abolition. Sumner's courage and passion, like Douglass's, are legendary. Following a particularly fiery speech in 1856, Sumner was attacked and nearly killed on the floor of the Senate by Preston Brooks, a pro-slavery representative from South Carolina. Only after 3 years of physical recovery from his wounds and 4 years of bloody civil war was Sumner able to successfully shepherd passage of the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments to the US Constitution through the legislature, legally ending slavery and providing an aspirational path forward towards full citizenship for all Americans, an ideal still elusive and inspiring. The doorway to the left of Seyfried leads to the old Senate chamber where Sumner was beaten, opposite the hall leading to the new chamber where the Reconstruction Amendments finally were passed. Taylor's photograph therefore succinctly encapsulates the devastating symbolic significance of violating what has been called America's sanctuary of democracy, the site of governance where our national rules of law are crafted for worse and for better. Reading Taylor's photograph within the framework of American law passed in that very space provides insight to how its desecration became possible and perhaps even inevitable. Seen through the lens of law and the legal concept of harm, Taylor's photograph presents us with a stark contrast: Sumner the victim and Seyfried the perpetrator. Preston Brooks, the South Carolina congressman who beat Sumner nearly to death, was arrested and ultimately fined for the crime of assault. The Seyfrieds also were charged in a federal court in Wilmington, Delaware 2 weeks ago. Ultimately, father and son collectively could spend a combined decade in prison and be subject to $250,000 in fines for their unlawful trespass and vandalism. They will not, however, be charged for carrying the nation's most potent symbol of white nationalism, white supremacy, and chattel slavery into the Capitol. In America, courts have consistently held that all flags are symbolic speech and therefore protected under the First Amendment of the US Constitution. This stands in stark contrast to legal standards in most of the world. For example, if Seyfried was charged in Germany or Austria for display of a Nazi flag in similar circumstances, he would face 3 years in prison for that crime alone. Most nations recognize the power of symbols and speech to lead to psychic trauma, political destabilization, and violence. Our American tradition of free speech is the response to colonial outrage that dissent against the crown had been suppressed, as well as a belief arising out of the Enlightenment in the power of vibrant expression to promote pluralism and creative and intellectual achievements. In the years following its ratification in 1791, the First Amendment was undeniably instrumental to the cause of dissent in general and racial progress in particular. Frederick Douglass, Ida B. Wells, and Martin Luther King Jr. all strategically utilized the protections of the First Amendment to circulate and amplify their, at the time, very unpopular ideas. In light of those principles, First Amendment jurisprudence in the 20th century largely hewed to the concept of content and viewpoint neutrality, under the implicit assumption that weakening Kevin Seyfried's right to fly the Confederate flag outside his home down the line would weaken someone else's right to fly a Black Lives Matter or LGBTQ pride flag. The events of January 6th, however, have called the question: did our traditions of free expression ultimately enable those who came so close to ending our democracy? And if so, can we survive our radically libertarian approach to speech in the age of the internet? To assess this question, think about the framework for the Seyfried's expression of symbolic speech on that day. Investigation is likely to reveal that they came to believe the election was stolen from Donald Trump by reading misinformation disseminated on social media platforms owned by private American corporations. They likely then further received instructions on these platforms as to when and where to go to #StopTheSteal. There's currently no provision in US law to hold social media companies civilly or criminally liable for their facilitation of what ultimately became deadly and destructive insurrection. The flow of misinformation and incitement that led the Seyfrieds to commit criminal trespass and insurrection was in fact entirely enabled by legislation passed in the building they invaded. Although the First Amendment only limits the government's ability to constrain speech in public forums, nevertheless, the ideal of content and viewpoint neutrality is enshrined in our culture and in our laws in a variety of ways. The United States is home to the world's largest search engines and social media platforms because of the safe harbor they have been given here in Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act of 1996. Section 230 states that no provider or user of an interactive computer service shall be treated as the publisher or speaker of any information provided by another information content provider. Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, etc., therefore are treated as mere conduits for information, with no liability for harm resulting from the communication that flows on their sites. Of course, companies like Facebook or Twitter are not mere passive conduits. They have actually amplified the voices of radical speech on the basis that it provokes more views than rational speech and therefore generates more advertising revenue. On January 6th, the dangers and fictions of our free speech arrangements were laid bare. Shortly after the riots, any remaining pretense that social media sites were mere conduits for speech evaporated. Twitter, Facebook, and other platforms blocked Donald Trump entirely. QAnon sites were eliminated, and Amazon dropped Parler from its hosting service, all of which thankfully crippled the ability of insurrectionist groups to communicate amongst themselves. Overnight, the ecosystem of American speech was restricted at a speed and scope unimaginable on January 5th. Previously, major social media sites had routinely scrubbed what they deemed offensive content, including nudity, sexual images, child pornography, suicide, etc. But in general, before January 6th, 2021, restricting speech defined as political was avoided, especially because doing so would hasten demands for reform of Section 230 by politicians who were censored, including Donald Trump. Transformative changes in communications law are now inevitable, and we should be hopeful that future harm can be prevented, but also wary about what will be erased from the new information landscape. Already, a great deal of art is removed from public view with little recourse. Most Americans likely will see increased government regulation of social media platforms as necessary and even welcome after the Capitol riots. However, artists, curators, and art audiences should not be naive about the threats that will inevitably accompany dramatic shifts in American communications law and in our traditional cultural embrace of free speech. Removing harmful expression from the vast flow of data on social media sites mostly involves moderation by algorithms triggered by specific phrases and images. These algorithms can easily be set to erase posts with the Confederate flag, in which case the psychic harm of seeing this image would be prevented. However, Taylor's photograph of Kevin Seafried also would be purged from our view. An army of human moderators might be able to distinguish some nuances of context and purpose, for example, the important legal difference between hate and incitement, but the power to determine the worthiness of speech placed into political and/or corporate hands should frighten us. Change must come, but we also need to think clearly about our best mechanisms for achieving it. Sometimes harmful images are the only way to see the truth. More symbolic expression, art, rather than less, should be at the forefront of our efforts. Can I have the next slide, please? In 2017, the Pennsylvania Academy of the Fine Arts acquired Unraveling by the artist Sonia Clark, which is one of the versions resulting from a performance the artist repeated in galleries and museums across the country. Next slide, please. In photos from the Speed Art Museum in 2017, we see Clark at right as she invites visitors to join her in unraveling a Confederate battle flag. As she labors together with her guests, painstakingly, slowly, she engages each one in conversation, turning audience members into neighbors working together to figuratively deconstruct racism. Next slide, please. Paradoxically and with grace, the harmful image becomes a site for community healing. It would be wonderful if Sonia Clark could perform Unraveling beside the portrait of Senator Sumner, with Senator Warren's aide Josh Delaney and others traumatized by the events of January 6th in attendance, to take part as a form of re-sanctification of the Capitol. And it would then be important for this reparative image to be shared as widely as possible, to symbolize the work we as a nation can and must do to deconstruct the harmful legacies of enslavement and structural racism. January 6th was a moment of great clarity that demonstrated the power of harmful images to terrorize, but it also revealed America as it really is. And with that comes the possibility of seeing and stitching up our deep wounds. Progress is possible and even evident. And I have the last slide, please. I would like to leave us with a hopeful image from the Capitol of Black National Guard soldiers posing with a statue of Rosa Parks while they were stationed there to protect legislatures and the inauguration. Parks's monumental image provided a precious, unfortunately rare focal point for them to gather and record a moment of pride and belonging. The task for the Capitol in coming years and for museums around the country will be to examine the images in their collections in light of the lessons of January 6th. We should strive to balance the reality of harm with the mission of displaying the world as it really is and has been, and amplify many more artworks like Unraveling and Rosa Parks which build the inclusive and unified society we hope to be. As Amanda Gorman so eloquently taught us just 2 weeks after the riots, being American is more than a pride we inherit. It's the past we stepped into and how we repair it. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Amy, and thank you for ending us with art and with hope. I'm going to stop my screen share, and we have time until 1:30 for discussion. I would like to, I know there may be some questions in the chat. I would like to give our colleague Barbara Wallanen, who is the retired curator of the Architect of the Capitol, an opportunity to speak if she would like to, and welcome her and thank her for being with us today.
I'm here. Okay.
Hi, Barbara.
Hi, how are you? This was wonderful. I mean, ever since I was at the Capitol, so many of those images were so disturbing to me, you know, of the way things were treated. And now people are finally really looking at them in a whole new way. And I think that's a really positive thing. I enjoyed all the talks. They really were, you know, very informative, different viewpoints. I pointed out in the chat that the Rosa Parks was actually commissioned by the Congress. It's not a state statue. So that was something I was involved in the whole process. So that was exciting. And the interesting thing was the legislation was proposed by Jesse Jackson Jr. And I got to speak with him one time, and he was adamant that she was going to be staring down Robert E. Lee and Jefferson Davis in Statuary Hall. But what we ended up doing is moving Robert E. Lee, who now is actually gone for the Capitol, but we moved him down to the crypt with the statues from the first 13 states. So when she was placed on the spot where Robert E. Lee had been, and she looks right across at Jefferson Davis. So that was very symbolic, yeah.
Thank you, Barbara. And our dear colleague, Dr. Sarah Beetham, who is on the call, just did a great blog interview with the Art newspaper about one of those statues, and its removal from the Capitol. I highly recommend that Art newspaper blog with Dr. Sarah Beetham.
Okay, I don't know that. Yeah, thank you.
Barbara, I wanted to ask you one question.
Sure.
Which I don't know if you can answer or not, but I've been thinking about it. We've been hearing something about how do we commemorate January 6th as a moment? There's been some talk of leaving some damage in the Capitol. It may be too soon to know, but is this something that people, curators, legislators are talking about?
I don't know. My successor, Michelle Cohen, may know, but I think they really cleaned up the Capitol for the inauguration, was my impression from, you know, watching it on TV. And the one thing I wanted to say, I was so thankful. Those people with all the flags, with all the poles, swords, they could have slashed paintings. They could have knocked parts of statues off, knocked them over. It was a miracle they did not do that. I mean, I was so scared when I saw them breaking in. They did damage. They left, you know, accretions on things. There's things to clean up, but wow, they could have done so much worse. And I think that's just, to me, it was a miracle in terms of the art collection. But they couldn't have been stopped if they did.
Mm-hmm.
So it was scary.
Yeah.
Okay.
Thank you, Barbara. I think I'm going to turn it over to Abby to moderate some questions for our panelists.
Of course. Thank you, Anna, and thank you everyone for those powerful presentations. We have a question from Laura Igo. Nice to see you here. Thank you for your question. And just a reminder, we have about a little under 15 minutes together, so put questions in the chat and we'll try to get to them. I'm going to just read part of this, but at a moment when many museums are rethinking what work they display and how it's interpreted, excuse me, can the Capitol rethink its display of problematic portraits and history painting or commission new work? And so you gave a great example. Sorry to condense your question, but I want to make sure from any of our panelists, it's such a great question of like, where do we go from here? But yes, if there's any thoughts on how to rethink currently and what we want to add. Feel free. Then
I'll jump in first to kick us off, because this was the question I was scared about us getting, but also the question I knew we needed to ask. So Laura, thank you for asking it. I think, when we think about the Capitol, we continually re-elect new officials and new representatives and make new laws. So there is no reason that, like the addition of the Rosa Parks, that we cannot add new art that may better reflect to our society. As a curator of 18th and 19th century art, I'm opposed to the destruction of art, but and this is really for our Congress and our representatives and our professional curators to choose what to do. But I think there could be wonderful new opportunities to add to the Capitol collection and to reinterpret, to reinstall. The Capitol also has an amazing museum, the visitor center. So even if, say, something went off view for a while or was changed out, there are still opportunities to see it and not hide it, but actually address it. So I think that there could be a call for great new art to help the building, or reinterpretation of the art. And those are just my thoughts.
If I could just comment that I think it's important to recognize that there are some works of art that had been commissioned in the 19th century that are no longer included. Most notably, the two statues that were in the east facade of the U.S. Capitol building on the staircase, and that's Greeno's Rescue and Persico's Discovery. And those statues were removed in the beginning of the 20th century when all the statues on the east facade of the US Capitol building were replaced by copies. And those two statues were never copied and put back in their place. You'd have to go through the archives in order to find the letters that various tribes had written protesting those two images. And there's no legislation, there's nothing written down explaining why those statues are gone. They're in damage, they were dropped, and they're still outside, right, Barbara, in Virginia? You have to unmute yourself.
That can't, they're in safe storage. They're in safe storage. Yeah, but yeah.
And one of the things I think all of us have to think about, and it also applies to the Confederate monuments, about the removal. I'm not saying that things should not be removed, but I would argue that in removing it, you're erasing history, and that maybe these statues all need to be placed in a different location so that we're preserving the history, but not glorifying them in places like the US Capitol building.
Christiane?
I think this is one of those cases where representation really matters. And by representation in this instance, I mean representation in the House and the Senate. I was really struck by what Barbara was saying when she said Jesse Jackson Jr. worked very hard to have the placement of the Rosa Parks statue, to encourage the Rosa Parks statue. I think of the work of the late, great John Lewis in having attention and address to not just voting rights, but questions of restitution and reparations. And reparations isn't just about money, it's about art, it's about representation. And so, in 1987, I didn't use this example, but in 1987, then Representative Ben Nighthorse Campbell, who later became Senator Ben Nighthorse Campbell, was sitting in a committee meeting of the House Committee on Interior Affairs. And he looked up and he was staring across the wall at a painting by Army officer Seth Eastman called Death Whoop. And Ben Nighthorse Campbell was successful in having that piece removed because it was fundamentally offensive to him as a Cheyenne man, as an elder, as a knowledge keeper. But, when he left the Senate, he was the last Native American senator. With Kamala Harris becoming vice president, which is amazing, we have no Black women in the Senate. If you don't see yourself reflected amongst representatives and senators, how are we supposed to have any kind of movement with an idea? It's wonderful to extend commissions, but this is also about who gets to be in the room.
My understanding was that Congress voted in July to remove portraits of Confederates. I'm not sure if it was from the entire US Capitol or from certain parts of it. But if we think about, making space for other forms of representation, I like to think we have the most diverse Congress we've ever had. Think about the legal concept of hostile workplace environment, right? Like the images that are up constitute a hostile workplace environment for the people who work there. And so I think we could think of that, again, the balancing of images that are kind of harmful, but maybe show us something about America as it has been, but then adding new voices, new perspectives, new works of art that really make the Capitol feel like a home for the diverse America we are and increasingly are represented by. And hopefully that is a trend that's going to continue into the future.
I'd love to hear Jackie's response before we move on to the next question.
I don't have a response. I don't have a fully baked response on this. I think that it will involve a lot of talking with a lot of different people who are effectively the consumers of images. You see a lot of movement in terms of public commissions. And yet oftentimes I find that there are at least two strains of discussion. There's the strains of people like us on the call who are art historians that are looking for a certain kind of modernist representation. And then there are people who are looking for realism. And this is an old story, whether it's Maya Lin's commission for the Vietnam War Memorial to more recent examples. But I know that people who have to live with the work should have the most audible microphone, if you will.
Thank you, Jackie. Abby, I'm wondering if you could go to Ramey's question particularly to Christian.
Perfect. Yeah, that was my plan. So thank you, Ramey, for this. So Ramey's interested in addressing this, or brings up the striking juxtaposition between the Capitol insurrection and the inauguration and how similar events of Indigenous erasure underlay both events. And so thinking of the Lakota historian Nick Estes' response to the inaugural address saying unity with whom and around what. And she'd be interested in hearing more from any of the panelists, but maybe especially Christian, about issues of unity at this moment as the talks have demonstrated the extent to which divisions at the root of these events and Capitol iconography are tied to American history. It's not the easiest thing to answer in the next couple of minutes, but I think such an important topic to think of. When that question of unity was brought up quite a bit during the inaugural address.
Question. It's a very hard question, and one that I don't think I can fully answer, because I think it's not something that you can do in a soundbite, and it's not something that can be resolved in an instant. I do think part of in regards to the question of unity, part of this revolves around, I think, what all of us have tried to get at today, which is a long, hard confrontation with what we are about and what we have been built with. And if you start in violence and blood and erasure and the denial of individuals to produce kinship, that is something that is, until that is addressed, that is always going to haunt us, right? We live in the land of the dead. We live in a spectral space. And I think, the best that I can say is, I think this is why Aleut scholar Eve Tuck and her co-author Kay Wen Yang in their essay, Decolonization as an Out of Metaphor, end it with saying, we have to lean into the incommensurability. We can't begin to imagine what something beyond this is if we cleave to the system that has birthed where we are, right? And I know that that's not really an answer, but I think it is at least an invitation that a process is possible, but we need to reckon with the past that is framing our present before we can move to a future.
I would say art really has the potential to help us educate people too. I mean, I teach, in New York City, and my students don't know that there was slavery in New York, when we go to the African burial ground, but they're shocked. I mean, and I think the education in New York is, from what I can tell from my students, actually, better than what students in Texas are getting from the public school curriculum, which has been so politicized. But, museums and galleries can add to what students understand about America. There's just so much total ignorance out there because of the education system. And then hopefully, those of us who are also kind of moving into public spheres, trying to really influence the education that our students are receiving in K-12. It's just a huge area for vast improvement.
Abby, have you been keeping up with the chat? Is there, we have 2 minutes left. Is there anything in there that you want to call out? Any questions?
I've not seen any. I mean, I think that we have lots of wonderful resources, and thank you folks for sharing. I think already, Amy, you bringing up education. We've got a few folks that are bringing up and other examples of monuments. I think in the moment we had left, I did want to make sure that if anybody, before we say thank you and goodbye, I did want to put in one last plug that we do have a topic tomorrow at noon, another Art at Noon on the topic of monuments, as they're intertwined. And so we'd love it if you're interested in further digging to this question of what our public monuments should look like and what replaces them. I'm going to drop a link to that in the chat. As well as I know there are many people that we had outages across the Northeast, and so there are folks that joined us late. Know that this video will be uploaded to our YouTube channel within about 24 hours or so. I'm going to drop all of those links in the chat now. And of course, I wanted to thank our amazing panelists and moderator for being here today and taking the time to address these difficult issues, but with thoughtfulness and insight. And I know I've learned a lot, and I'm so excited to dig into some of the resources you shared with us. So huge round of applause for all of you. Thank you so much for being here. And Anna, I'll give you the last word.
All right. Well, I just want to thank everyone for, all of you who I asked to join us said yes right away. We had like about 2 weeks to plan this, and uncategorically, everything you said was so thoughtful, and you put your scholarship, but also your heart into it. Which I really appreciate. I think that's something we all really need right now. And I also want to say thank you to our members for being with us. And if you liked this program and you want to see more of it, this was a free program. Please consider joining PAFA or support your local museum so we can continue to have these difficult but nuanced conversations. Thank you, and see you in the next Zoom.